Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and after my posts about Sodley over the last week, a number of people have asked me how I'm managing to get such a high score in Arena. It's even funny to me because I closed out the week at about 110 or 111,000 points. And I think they commented on a post where I only had somewhere between 20 to 40, so it still wasn't even near what I would get to by the end of the week. Couple things up front though, this is a series for new and returning players, and this video kind of isn't. I mean, returning players, sure, you probably could shape up and get yourself high in Arena faster than most people could, but it will take a little bit of prep, and we'll talk about that. But new players, well, there's no quick way for you to do this. Sure, there's going to be plenty of opportunities where you have bonus units because they flood you with Viz and resources early on, and if you spend those wisely, you should be able to pull a few banner units and maybe even vision cards, although I don't recommend the latter as much. But there is a possibility that you could kind of get back into the game that way and be able to compete. But really, for me, considering that we are competing at the highest level against the entire world, against players who have been playing this game for going on 5 years. If you're competing against me, I'm about a 4-year player at this point. I have been collecting stuff, I've been getting the best things in the game and maxing them out for quite some time now. So I have a pretty impressive collection of stuff that is sometimes relevant in Arena. But what you're going to need at minimum, this is really what I consider the prerequisites. You want at least 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 pieces of relevant UR equipment for your team. At least that. You definitely want UR level armors, you definitely want UR level TMRs, and you might be able to get away with MR level signature weapons, but usually lower rarity stuff either isn't strong enough, or it isn't strong enough in combination with the limited pool of characters that can actually use it, save for maybe one. So there are some off cases where there isn't a signature weapon and maybe you're running an all black mage team or an all strike team or an all slash team or something, and there's just only so many good options. But generally speaking, you want 6 to 7 minimum UR items. The TMRs and the armor is basically non-negotiable, and you want to be using legendary reliquaries equipment basically where possible. There are some exceptions to this, but there are several characters who want builds that includes not 1 but 2 pieces of legendary reliquaries equipment, so you want to be able to do that as well. That is by far the hardest part of this equation, because especially for those UR armors, you're going to have to wait for raid revival. That's going to be your best time. Even a standard raid, while it may give you one option, won't give you the selection of armors that your team is probably going to need. Meanwhile, raid revivals are actually a pretty good way of catching up in this way and happen maybe every 3 months. So, at worst, this strategy might take you 3 or 4 months to execute. Seriously, this part of the strategy is the hardest. The one that lands right there in the middle in terms of difficulty, in that it's arguably harder, but you can shortcut it a lot more with money. You can't, take out a loan and pay Gumi to run a raid revival just for you. But you can pull a lot. And naturally, maybe you are pulling a lot, especially if you're a newer account. Throwing in more money into that, because modern vision card banners are not great. They're expensive. The cards are pretty good, but I think in a lot of cases you want older pool vision cards to fill in spots in a variety of teams, and just because getting 3 consecutive job-based vision cards, or even 6, is going to be really expensive, and there's probably not going to be even 3 of those that work for any given team. You know what I mean? That's a really hard and expensive and probably time-consuming, because even that would maybe take 3 months, and you still wouldn't have a set for a team if you didn't get other vision cards along the way. The only way to really short-circuit this is to just pull more. So I'm going to assume that you're going to slow roll that part, and maybe you wait 6 months or so from the time you start playing this game, after a couple of raid revivals, after you've built up a variety of characters to have relevant UR TMRs, even if you aren't planning to use that character. It's a whole other set of characters you have to build up at least somewhat. Once you have all that, there is one kind of final prerequisite, and that is for me to just preface how important the bonus system is if you actually want to get a top score, because the bonus can as much as quadruple your score. Often it's not actually possible to quadruple your score with the bonus system, just because there literally aren't the options available. Often you're going to max out practically at 375, which is actually 275% bonus in your base, which is 100%. I know somebody got confused about the math on that in the comments. And for this week, in some of the Veritas of the Earth footage that I'm going to show you, I'm sitting comfortably at a 300% bonus. Last week, I was running anywhere from I think 250% bonus when I was really having trouble with the teams and needed more power, needed one more optimized vision card. Basically, I was just, it was really a big part of it was just giving my team AoE resistance. Was proving to be stabilizing in a number of matches that I was maybe having a coin flips or something uncomfortably close to a coin flip chance of winning. But at other times, when I could afford it, when my matchup was much better and I didn't need that extra power, I could go all the way up to 325. For this one, I'm getting 300% by having the newest vision card and the newest unit. And I don't have any of the other bonus vision cards. So I'm only running one bonus. It is optimized perfectly for my team. So I can run a perfected set of vision cards. I am essentially facing no de-optimization through the bonus system. Last week, I had to run 2 vision cards that did not benefit Sodily at all because they were night vision cards. I also didn't have as much flexibility to run Veritas of the Earth because neither of them supported Monk. But Sodily's vision card, our bonus vision card for this week, does. So this team works just as well, this vision card and strategy works just as well for either team, so I can freely swap them without losing bonus points. And again, I'm running them at full power, basically. I wouldn't have changed my vision card selections even if the bonuses, or even if this wasn't a bonus card. I guess if there were other bonus cards, I would swap them in, because I kind of would have to. And you really want to have at least 250%. When I was dropping down to that, it kind of hurt, but it was doable. You want to be as high above 250% as you can, which means you want an additional 150%. Easily, if you have the newest unit, that's 100% right there. You can grab one of the vision cards and you're good to go. If you have 2 vision cards, you're probably getting at least a 300% bonus, and that's great. Good job. And if you can go further than that, or you have even newer vision cards, or even the ones that they really want right now, then you really have a good opportunity to win. But next we're going to have to talk about math. Math is how you get there. And let's talk about the math of getting a lot of points. Here is the equation as I understand it. As far as I can tell, you get about 20 points for a loss. There's one part of this equation I'm uncertain of. It feels variable in a way that I don't understand. It feels like this formula goes just a little bit deeper, and I've never heard anybody talk about how this exactly works. But there are a number of bonuses that we are aware of in game that I can use to demystify this a bit. right? So when you lose, you tend to get around 20 to 40 points. This will be modified by your bonus modifier as far as I can tell. It's not modified by the rate bonus, and it's also not modified by a winning streak bonus because you just lost. From there, you get additional points based on your winning streak. The highest winning streak bonus you can have is 18% for some reason, which in my opinion is pretty low, and that also means that your win streak essentially caps out relatively early and accelerates relatively fast. The thing that is advantageous about this is it allows for more experimentation because it's not nearly as punishing if you lose. But you still don't want to lose often and break that 18% bonus because every little bit helps. But if you're noticing, that 18% is just icing on the cake compared to the huge modifier that you get through the bonus system of having the right units and vision cards. And this isn't the only way that having Viz on hand is going to help you, believe me. But also, there's a whole another prerequisite that I basically forgot early on, and that's that you want to have at least 21 arena restore orbs. I don't know how to tell you how to farm these or get these more effectively. They're basically a thing that's been accumulating as I don't do arena that often or min-max it and just play my dailies, because that will, on a monthly basis, reward you a certain number of orbs, and if you don't use them, you can bank them. The reason I say you need 21 is that's the max you can use in a week, and since this isn't Viz, we are going to be fully investing into this every day, so you need 21 of those. This is going to give us 20 fights a day at minimum to score our points with. Often, especially early in the week, we won't need more than that, or we won't need much more than that. It's really on the last day or the last couple of days that people really start to play this like a game of poker and just start throwing Viz into the ante pool. So if you win, you get a larger modifier. This kind of base total seems to be something around 150 to 200 points. Again, how well you win, maybe how much health you had or how little damage you took, or factors like this, how many units you had alive at the end of the battle, can micromanage what this score is in a way that is kind of hard to account for, except to say that if you win better, maybe you get more points. But honestly, I haven't even put the due diligence in to be able to confirm that. At the point of my study of this particular variable, it still feels a bit random, but this is the range that will then be modified by your bonus. So let's say it's 150 points for your win. You have 200% bonus, which adds 200% to your base of 100%, and that is going to raise your total score so far up to 450. You're also going to get about 81 points extra for having a full win streak bonus. So that's going to put you at 531 points. There's one last modifier here that we haven't talked about yet, and this one is going to affect your strategy a lot, and it's going to get really important for high-level play. But so far, if you're looking to score the top 1,000, top 5,000, you don't even need all the advice I just gave you. Maybe this comes into play if you're hitting top 1,000, top 500, top 100, more certainly, yes. But once you get up to, say, maybe the top 500, top 200, you'll start to notice a new modifier, and this is a rate bonus. For most of the game so far, you've seen two rate bonuses in Arena, 0.99 and 1.00. 1.00 is basically anyone who has a score that's higher than you, but I want to say isn't that much higher than you. You're only off by a couple of points. I think the window for this is maybe like 500 points. So maybe you're within a win of them, or maybe less. Well, no, it should increase. No, it increases like by 100th at a time. So it would be 50 points. They're within 50 points of you. And Arena is so jam-packed with people in the lower ranks that you'll see dozens of people with the same score. So basically, anyone in that window of 10 people who have a slightly higher score or are tied with you, you're gonna not get a bonus. And if you fight anyone in the 10 below you, you're actually gonna lose 1%. But again, the scores are so close together in your window of 20 for most of the Arena experience that this is the most negligible difference. It is not one that you have to understand unless you plan to go top 500 or above. But once you start cracking into like the top 250, especially the top 200, you're going to start to notice that in some cases, that rate modifier for teams below you could drop all the way down to like 0.5 if they're way behind you. And by way behind you, I mean about 5,000 points behind you, which is a lot. If you're kind of following the math here, then if you got this bonus, that would be another 265 points. So it's like 846 points. If you have a max rate bonus, 200% bonus modifier, which again could go up to 300 in theory, even though, like, say this week, the highest possible modifier is 275. So you're almost there. And if you maxed out all of these, then a victory could easily get you about 1,000 points. So when I say that they're way behind you, I'm talking they're like 5 wins with max bonuses behind you. And almost no one is, for a number of reasons, always getting max bonuses. To run a little bit of score analysis on some famous YouTubers who share a guild, share strategies. They actually have a podcast show together, JB79 and Ready Player Will. So I know that they're going to be using some of the same general strats. I know that they're going to come from the same school of thought, roughly. And they were hovering near each other about 5 ranks below me for most of my run. They seemed to be kind of sandbagging, playing easy early on so that a counter meta didn't develop, and that's something we'll talk about later, and something that maybe is a good strategy. But this made it really hard for them to rush into the top ranks because they were just way too far behind. I don't think there literally would have been time for JB79 to have made a comeback and even get into the top 5 or so. Although I think he may have actually finished in the top 10. It may have finished above me because I went to sleep at 3:30 instead of 4 a.m. Yeah. And that's why this is a top 20 guide, second disclaimer, and not a number 1 guide, because you're not going to like the strategy for getting to number 1. I don't like the strat. I've never actually scored in the top 10. I've been number 1 when I've fallen asleep at 3:30. And I always lose like 10 ranks in that last 30 minutes. It's ridiculous. And this time, I had created like a 10,000 point, maybe even 15,000 point buffer between some of the teams that would have to have scored those points to knock me out of the top 10, and more than enough did. I ended up in 12th, which is actually my highest score yet. So I'm still kind of proud of myself for it. But I'm aiming to maybe even do better this week. So, now that you understand how the scoring system works, and you understand how it's possible, although definitely not likely, to score up to 1,000 points for a single win, it's also important to understand the other strategic dynamics of top rank arena. one, it's going to help to be flexible and have a variety of teams. Either being able to swap out a non-bonus unit on your team to provide flexibility, or being able to run other elements, maybe with different bonus packages that are at least similar if you really go that hard as to have two different elements that are kind of bonus ready at the time. Maybe shifting between a team that goes above 300 in your preferred element or your preferred setup, and then a team in kind of an element that can deal with their counter element or their counter play, so that if they can't win, you still can. That maybe only goes up to 250. That's a really good strategy, and I see people rotating between maybe 3 teams quite often, because if you have 3 good teams in different elements and strategies, it's going to be hard to find teams that you can't beat within your window. That being said, because of the way that the rate bonus works, even though you have a window of 20, you basically only have 10 people that you can beat and really keep up the pace that you need to succeed. And speaking of the pace that you need to succeed, that 18% win streak bonus is pretty important to just edging out competition and not having to pump a lot of viz into this to keep up with people. Because if you're really committed, you are going to have to ante up eventually. And how much and how often and how frequently you have to ante up is going to be determined by how well you manage things like this. So let's talk about loss management, because you're going to lose probably a lot. Hopefully not too much, because it does start to get counterproductive, but you can learn to lose more efficiently. This is something I talked about in my last video. There's a lot of matchups where you have like an 80 to 90% chance to win, but say someone lands an inopportune side. If your win rate was doing that well against them, though, this is basically a fluke. And that also makes it a good opportunity to scout out some of your opponents. Especially if you've won 9 matches in a row against a single player who is at kind of a 1.5 rate when you started, it's pretty likely that they aren't at a 1.5 rate anymore. And this is gradually dropping every consecutive win you get. And at 9 wins, if they aren't actively playing and putting points on the board while you're playing so that you don't actually catch up to them, which is kind of a team strategy that has some potential for abuse, and I think that there are sometimes duos that show up and can kind of utilize this strategy. But eventually, you're going to get to the point where you either get close enough to their score that their rate modifier is lower, or that it's actually lower than 1, which is really bad for you. You want to be constantly targeting 1.5s. So, especially if you're newer to the top 10, or if over the last day you've seen a bunch of new faces show up to the top 10, or a bunch of the competitive players are switching teams and there's teams that you're unfamiliar with your matchups against, I would generally look at the 10 people who are ahead of you, focusing on everyone who has a better rate than the opponent you're pretty sure you can beat. But why get a lower rate than that? Especially if you aren't as certain you can win against that team. But go against the top team that you think you have a shot at. Even if you don't think it's a good shot, it's better to figure it out now than any other time. But also, by aiming as high as you can early, you'll start to realize which players that are going to be higher ranked and therefore more often have a higher rate bonus you'll be able to beat. So in the future, as you've built up this knowledge of what your good matchups are against specific players in very specific teams, or even very specific outfittings of teams, it could become very important for you to check people's vision cards especially. For instance, last week, I usually couldn't deal with a team if it had more than 2 wind units, especially because if you've leveled him up, Duran is a pretty decent wind tank, and especially with a unit that can maybe one-shot some characters on my team after some of their shields have been broken and some of their initial defenses have been nullified. Yeah, he's a mess. But even with just Shurika, if you had wind vision cards, even if she was the only wind unit on the team, even if this basically lowered the power level of the other units on the team, if you could stack, I think it's probably something like 33% I think it's something like maybe 33 or more percent elemental resistance through the vision card system to Earth on Shurika, then suddenly I don't have a very good matchup anymore. And, sometimes it gets that specific. So this is your time to experiment, because there's much less on the line. If you fail now, it's okay. And if you win, because you started as high as you could go, just keep beating that team if you can. It's going to have the highest rate of the ones that you feel like you could beat. I mean, maybe there is some argument to say that that's only a one win, and that's not necessarily a streak yet, and that maybe have a little bit more patience, especially on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, while you're still trying to assess your opponents. And scouting in this way, like just testing people's teams when you don't have a win streak or don't have much of a win streak, is going to provide you valuable knowledge that could easily translate into more points later in the week. Then again, if you're post-Wednesday, this is probably a good time to take what you can get and experiment as little as possible, because at this point, hopefully, you've been experimenting enough by using this strategy Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday that you know what you need to know, and you don't need to experiment as much now. Maybe now you're just noticing people running slightly different vision cards. Maybe somebody swapped out a Gilgamesh for a Shurika and you're not sure how that affects your matchup. There's a lot of things that could happen like that you might still want to test, but essentially you want to get your testing done within the first part of the week, because the closer you get to the finals, the more competitive it's going to get. So there's another quirk of the rate modifier that creates a whole interconnected web of strategy. This one bonus actually does way more for top tier strategy in Arena than you would realize, and I think more than most people would realize, because again, if you haven't ever ranked above 250 in Arena, this may not even be a mechanic that you have been exposed to, much less exposed to enough to realize how much it can affect your score. What this means is that you're probably the best at scoring points when you're at least 5,000 behind whoever's in first place. But that also means that once you get 5,000 points in the lead as the first place player, literally any fight that you would take will only give you half points, because you're going to be facing 0.5 modifiers all the way down. This means that in order to build a significant lead against your opponents, you have to eat some really, really bad bonuses. On one hand, I would like to avoid this, at least early in the week. I find it kind of pointless. The further ahead you get, the further you build that lead, the easier it is for people to catch up, while the harder it becomes every step of the way to keep building that lead further and further. That being said, especially towards the end of the week, that's kind of what you want to be doing in order to build yourself cushion so that people don't just overtake you at the last second. And even then, you need a lot of cushion. And how much cushion you need on any individual day, how many times you'll have to go into Viz to be able to keep yourself in the top 10 or top 20 is really going to depend on how much people are escalating at the top, how much people are pushing forward. Because if one person pushes forward 3,000 or 4,000 points, it's going to be hard for them. In a way, if you're thinking about like average efficiency, they're kind of handicapping themselves a little bit, while at the same time giving direct advantages to anyone in the ranks below them or in the top 20, because that's going to be your window at all times if you're number one or if you're above top 10. You're just giving any of those people, but especially those who are closest to overtaking you, an even higher rate bonus to take you down with, which is kind of equalizing. On one hand, it means that no one can ever really run away with the game. But on the other hand, it means that you're always like the person in number 2 spending 100 Visior away and maybe 25 minutes of load times away from overtaking you. And that's not to mention that not only are you not getting the 1.5 in first place, like the best you could do for a rate modifier if you're in first place is about 0.99. And it's only going to get worse from there as you build your lead over second. Even if you can beat second place, and if you've managed to get into first place, but you can only beat third or fourth, you've been having this problem for even longer, and it's an even harder climb up. Again, this is not to say that it's not worth doing later in the week. And if you notice that there's a huge gap between groups, if you can get yourself on the other side of that gap by paying in a little bit more viz, well, that could be a really good investment in the long run. Because, I mean, this disadvantage only really hits the person in first place all that hard. Everyone below that point is usually going to have pretty decent rate modifiers as long as they can beat someone who's higher ranked than them. And their rate modifiers are only about as bad as whatever the person in first place is currently getting if they have to punch a little bit below their overall rank. So, in order to really compete, and in order to very, very consistently be able to get a 1.5 rate modifier, you probably want to be in the top 20 to the top 10. Once you're in the top 10, you will be able to challenge anyone in the top 20 at any time. If you're in the top 20, you should at least be able to target the people who are, top 10 to top 30, and that's at least putting you within a good window of making it to the top. Now, here's a controversial question, and one that I feel like I strategically fail every time I play Arena hard. And that is, I'm excitable and I have a little bit of an ego, and as a content creator, it's always good for me to get videos of me smashing top tier stuff. So I like to go to number 1 as soon as I can, and usually if I'm playing for this, I'm trying to achieve number 1 rank at least once a day. That's making me the player to beat. Now usually I don't go any further than overtaking number 2. I'm not trying to be inefficient and build up a lead early on. But the fact that I keep putting myself in first place and that there's 19 other players that have a target on my back, it means that any of them can consistently, and if they're playing at the right times on a daily basis, whip out their counter team to whatever I'm playing and get some easy and sure points and maybe make their way all the way up to first or even second. Because again, if I'm in first and they're beating me, they're going to be able to rocket through the top 20 until maybe they hit like the top 10, only really slowing down with the top 5. And as long as they have 3 or 4 restores, within a day, even without dipping into their viz, they could probably take themselves from 20 to number 1 if nobody else really moves up. I mean, they're not going to stay number 1 at the end of the day because everybody else has orbs and somebody might start paying viz to defend their top 5, top 10 lead. Editor Fox here. There's one more thing that I wanted to talk about in this, and that is the kind of ecosystemic part of the way that Arena and the shifting top 20 meta tends to work out. For instance, while I was occupying a lot of time in first place, the top 10 was largely made up of teams that were running Shuriken. This made it harder for me to get back into the top 10, but there were still teams and ways of doing it if I just waited another couple hours. Because what would happen after that is that with a top 10 full of Shuriken, suddenly you would start to see Gilgamesh teams rising to the top. Or you would see players that were formerly playing Shuriken as like their one-off on their team, now playing Gilgamesh as more of a one-off on their team to take out the Shuriken players. Suddenly the meta has gone from beating Earth, beating me, to beating Wind, the people who were preying on me. And then, shortly after that, you'll also see some modifier, you'll see Flame Wizard, you'll see Sephiroth, you'll see even more Summer Resnick. She seems to survive in all of these because she has relatively good matchups into all of it. She's a very common healer to see splashed and maybe second most is Lucielle. You'll see her a lot regardless, which isn't necessarily an advantage to playing Earth because she doesn't typically come in range early enough for her weakness to Earth to really be a problem, especially since I don't have enough range to hit her in the back row necessarily, especially if she can keep the units in front of her alive so that I'm not advancing quickly. She's basically stalling my progress towards her by healing her team well. Using them as her pawns, I think, thematically, and given with like the narrative. But after you see that, then you'll see a player come in who's running like Elda, King of the Lions, Joom, Veritas of the Waters. You'll start seeing some of those. And then after that happens, you start seeing someone who's maybe running lightning teams. This is a little bit more rare, but by the time that happens, my Earth team has good matchups into a variety of those elements. My problem is really wind. But if I wait for other elements to start getting play and shifting into the top, I can interact pretty favorably with most fire-based teams. I can usually interact pretty favorably with Gilgamesh because he takes a lot of damage from Sottily. So there's a number of these that I'll do well with. I just kind of have to wait for some of the wind to die out or some of the wind to get countered, and then I can just rise back up. And because I have advantages through so many parts of that cycle, I'll be doing well for a while, and then by the time I'm back in first, all the wind teams are coming for me again. It's just a really interesting way that it kind of cycles through the 6 elements, and this can be a benefit for people who are able to competently play 1 or 2 of those elements. This isn't really something I can do with this team. If I had Gilgamesh, I think I could probably play Ice Magic pretty well, or maybe some sort of a combination team that would do better with Shurika. That way I would be able to play into 100% of the meta, and that was basically my intention in building this account. I just missed the most consequential ice unit ever, so I'm kind of locked out of being able to play ice very well into this, but here we are. So that puts me in a really awkward spot for this, but the thing that a lot of people are discounting, while I am easy to counter, and as some people in the comments who are playing Shurika right now have pointed out, that's a blessing to their scores as well. I also have good matchups most of the time that people aren't playing Shurika, so I count that as a win for myself too. But yeah, while it is not nearly as big as the bonus modifiers for units and vision cards, the rate modifier ends up being one of the most consequential bonuses for your overall efficiency in top tier gameplay. And part of the reason for that is that it's the only modifier that can actually punish you. And it is incredibly punishing to hit a 0.5 on this. Let's go back to the arena math formula for a win just to see how punishing this can be. Okay, so we're assuming that you get about 150 points as your base win score. We're also assuming that you have 2 100% bonuses like I do this week, which is not the max, it is pretty good. It's a little bit over what I would say the minimum for trying to achieve this is. So that's going to triple my score all the way up to 450. Then I should be able to get another 81 points, putting me at 531 from having a win streak of I think 10 or more to get an 18% bonus. A rate modifier of 1.5 can take that all the way up to around 800 points. But if I get a 0.5 rate modifier, it's going to take me all the way down to about 265 or 266 points. The difference between getting half points on this and getting full points on this is essentially a factor of 3. So again, technically, it doesn't have as big of an impact as the bonus system, and you're only really going to interact with this if you get really high ranked. But within the context of that, it can triple your efficiency to be able to use this correctly, as opposed to going for a lower ranked team that you know you can beat. So even hedging your bets, fighting safe teams, and winning constantly isn't the best strategy. This rate bonus really pushes you to figure out how your team works against basically the entire meta so that you can always be getting maximum points. Okay, for this last part, keep in mind that my personal time zone is Eastern Standard Time. So when I say 4 a.m., I mean 4 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please convert that to whatever time zone you live in. And since this is a global game, for some of you, this might not actually be as annoying as it is for me, where I live. Because let me share two personal stories from weeks that I was multiple times at number 1 in Arena, and was maybe even number 1 in Arena on Sunday. Staying up until Monday morning at 3:30, in both instances, I was either at number 1 or in the top 5, or even most recently number 5. And each one of those times I either thought I had a good enough cushion that either enough people weren't awake, or enough people wouldn't catch up with me, or enough people wouldn't close the gap. But in any case, I was wrong, and in every case I was knocked out of the top 10. So really, if you want to make number 1, you're good, or at least, let me make this me specific again, because of the time zones. Some of you may have an easier time of this than I do. But for me, I either have to stay up to or wake up at about 2 in the morning. At this point, I want to be in the top 15. And especially if I went to sleep for a little while, or haven't played much this day, I'm probably going to have knocked back to at least around the top 15. And strategically, I don't necessarily want to hold the top rank or be in the top 10 too much on the final day. I want people to get used to playing teams that don't beat mine. I want people to get used to the idea that they're going to have to beat other different types of teams. And so that hopefully in the last minutes and last hours, they're not playing something that counters me, and I can find someone within the top 5, the top 3, or hopefully the person at number 1. And then for the next 2 hours, I will spam my viz, skip every match, because I cannot afford to wait for them to play out. You seriously do not have the time. Honestly, it's to a point where if there were any way to make the load screen work faster, if this were dependent on your internet connection or your type of emulation or whatever, I would say if you actually want to be number 1, you should figure that out and figure out what the fastest way to load your game is. Because load times will limit how quickly you can put on points, and if someone does have an advantage in that way, it could become really important between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Because if you're at roughly the same score, have roughly the same win rate, and are fighting roughly the same rank of teams, they're just going to score points more than you. And if you're competing for the top 20, you know this. You know it's going to be like this. Either that or it's your first time. This is your introduction to how brutal and unforgiving the last 30 minutes of play can be. You can go from number 1 to 13 on a busy week, and even on a slow week, you can go from 5 to 12. Even if you had a 10 to 15,000 point lead over a lot of those people who would eventually overtake you, there are people who will wait until the exact last second and they will spam viz for extra fights just until 4 a.m. Do not stop. I thought I had built a good lead 30 minutes before the end, and I was wrong, because at least 7 people below me just kept spending until the last second to knock me out of the top 10. So, at a certain point, you've got to be well positioned to be able to take the top. But you also don't want to have dipped too much into your viz, and honestly, it might even be good to have some of your arena refills. Kind of sandbag all of Sunday or most of Sunday. Maybe do your first 5 fights to keep yourself in the top 20 so that you're not just facing an impossible uphill battle at 2 a.m. But if you're in decent place to take the top at 2 a.m., from that point, you need to know who you can beat, because you can't afford to sit around and watch a match. You have to know why you can beat them, because you won't have the information to adjust your team, because again, you cannot wait to see that match. You're going to skip that thing as soon as you can, and you're really going to hope you win. And then you're going to repeat that for 2 hours, or until you run out of viz. And if you run out of viz, you're screwed. If you have a very limited number of Vizior restores, and this is tied to Royal rank, so newer players, returning players who haven't played for a while, but especially people who haven't spent any money on the game, are going to have less than others. So really, you can slam your foot on the gas for far longer if you're a more whaley player. But as long as you have decent rank around 2, even if you have less Vizior restores than I do, to the point where even if you slammed your foot on the nitro the whole time and burnt through your viz as fast as you could, you'd still run out by 3 o'clock. If that's the case, if you feel like you only have an hour's worth of viz left, or viz restores left, if for some reason you've had to burn a lot to get back into the top 20 today because you didn't finish on Saturday the way you wanted to or something, if you're really falling behind, then it would actually be better to start closer to 3 o'clock. Because while it is important to be slamming viz restores on that last day for as long as you can, it's more important to be slamming them right before the bell, to be the last person to win a match sometimes, if it's particularly competitive. And this can come down to just who loads in faster. And sometimes, and this is hard to control, just being able to win a match faster, therefore maybe teams that emphasize hard damage a little bit more than sustain or stall, are actually going to have slower load times, because your load time seems to correlate to the length of the fight that is loading. Basically, it's emulating it at a faster speed, but it still has to wait for the fight to play out before it knows what to tell you. Naturally, certain teams that fit a more all DPS strategy will have slightly lower load times, and that's going to give you, again, a slight edge. But also, if that is you still, that also might burn through your biz a little bit faster. And again, the most important thing is to still be spending biz at 3:55, basically. 5 minutes to deadline. Well, maybe not 5 minutes, but like 7 minutes to deadline. Load times are a bitch. 8 minutes to... If you have a bad internet connection, 10 minutes to load time. You still want to be spending biz. You still want to be winning right at the end, because that gives you the best chance at ranking up in the top. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about another advanced strategy. And when I say advanced strategy here, I don't know. When I say advanced strategy, this is kind of how you think about it when you're playing, but also there's a way to game this too. So the best case scenario for you is that someone has a 5,000 point lead on you, you can beat their team, and you're playing while they're rising in the ranks. I don't know how you figure out when they're playing, but if you watch their score enough, when you start to see it come up, if you start beating them and you play for roughly the same amount of time that they do, then you'll rise with them. And instead of most cases where with every win your rate bonus might be lowering, it's not going to lower because they're going up at roughly the same rate. this also means that you won't gain rank as fast in that case, because while you're still going to be passing a lot of the same people that they're passing who aren't currently playing, you're not going to ever pass them. So that's one rank that you won't pick up compared to if they were standing still. But at the same time, this might help you play more sustainably at a higher score level for longer. So how is this a thing that you could utilize teamwork in? Well, if you have two players, probably from the same guild or just someone that you know personally, a friend of yours who plays the game, you could have them have a perfect, like, for instance, if I wanted to bring somebody up with me, and they really wanted to get into the top 10 or top 20, and I was planning to play an all-earth team to get up into the top 10, then they could stay roughly 5,000 points behind me. I could tell them when I'm playing and when I'm moving up so that they can stay in my window. This is going to be almost impossible to do, by the way, until you get up to the top 250, just because you gain too many ranks with each win when you're in those higher or lower ranks. It only becomes a thing where you're facing the same person in the same window multiple times once you get up higher. And that's when that knowledge of who you can beat starts to become more valuable as well. So if you stay in the window with this other player that's 5,000 points ahead of you, but you can beat, and you know you're playing at the same time as them, then you can both essentially rise through the ranks together. You could even switch off and kind of do this leapfrog effect, where if you can both switch to having teams that can beat each other, then you could alternate at a certain point once you start to pass and lose efficiency, and then they could speed up and go ahead of you by switching to a different team. This is a little bit more complicated, and honestly I think the two of you just rising at the same time, which takes a lot more coordination in a lot of ways, or at least in timing, takes communication at the very least. You have to know when the other person is playing. Whereas the other strategy, you can kind of alternate. You can wait until they've played to a certain point, then they'll wait for you, and then you wait for them. That could work with significantly less communication. But even if you weren't directly coordinating with a player, you could always just kind of keep an eye on the players that you can beat. Typically, the way that I choose when I spend my refills during the day is when I have someone who's like 6,000 or 7,000 points ahead of me, so that I can get maybe 3 or 4 wins in against them before I go below the 1.5 rate. But that's maybe in the top 3. And I'll keep beating them maybe all the way until the point where I'm in the top 5 or just a little bit below them, or maybe even just ahead of them. I really don't want a negative rate, but I will, if it can get me into the top 5, fight them until I get that 0.99 rate. I will fight them all the way down to a neutral 1. And with all that being said, I think that's it. I mean, this has been a fairly long video and pretty in-depth, but this is also really specialized knowledge that I don't think a lot of people are sharing. Like, I haven't necessarily seen a video that went this in-depth in a lot of these strategies. And the ones that I have made that touched on these things, but never, like a lot of videos in this series, like, these are things that I've talked about in multiple videos, but never as its own topic. This one came the closest because they did do a Gumi economics about whether or not Arena is rigged and how pay to win is it, and what's the least pay to win form of PvP, which I think is probably class match. But yeah, Arena doesn't necessarily do that great from that perspective. But if you have the extra Viz and the extra Arena orbs and you want the fight of your life, this is one hell of a Final Fantasy Super Boss battle, because you are fighting literally the world in order to be the very best, like no one ever was. To become a transcendent mind is my real test. To transcend them is my cause. Gotchamon. Gotta pull them all. Well, at least enough to build a top tier team. That's 300 cost units, you bean. I'll pull them. You pull me. Cut. That one's... Wait, what? That took a hard turn. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, the free-to-play option for the channel and for YouTube in general is to like, subscribe, ring the bell, because jokes like that can sometimes get my videos like deprioritized in the search algorithm and things like that. So if you want to see all the wotv content I can produce, and I'll keep it coming, then ring that bell and you will never miss a beat or a bad joke. You can also check out the link in the description to see all the corners of the Jackie Fox Media universe, including books in various different genres I talk about to death at the outros of this channel, so I'll save you that on this one since it was a longer one. But just check out my books. Hardcover for It Even Happens While We Sleep is on sale for $15, so pick that up while supplies last. And thank you so much for watching. Comment, talk to your fellow community members down there in the comments. The community is a big part of what keeps a game running strong. It's also very important for this channel as well. So let them know what you're thinking in the comments. If you're really diehard, there's not a ton of people on my Discord right now, but if you want to find a place to talk about War of the Visions in a kind of cultured and cultivated space that might be a little quiet at times, but will generally answer the questions that you need answers to, then check out my Discord. There'll be a link for that as well. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.